We human beings are a needy lot. A baby needs to be fed and changed and held, and so she cries. Being a bit inept when it comes to computers, when I need help, I consult the local computer guru, Father Ron. I consult him a lot. Let's say you're a young adult having trouble meeting the right person. So in your need, you ask a trusted friend to introduce you to someone nice. Or maybe you turn to an online dating service. Though we can handle relatively small matters like these, with so much else, it's another story. The Israelites could not feed them or free themselves from slavery in Egypt, but God could and did, just as he later fed them with manna in the desert because they were unable to feed themselves. In today's passage from the second book of Kings, the prophet Elisha is able to feed 100 people with only 20 loaves of bread because God is at work in him in a marvelous way. The Son of God does something even more amazing for the hungry thousands who come looking for him in our reading from John's Gospel. My friends, in our need, we do well to turn trustingly to God rather than relying on ourselves for the solution, for we are not terribly wise. For example, the wisdom of the crowd in today's verses from John is seen to be lacking. Because Jesus fills their stomach, they are intent on making him their king. They think of him as the prophet who is to come, by which they mean a prophet like Moses. They're not anticipating Jesus as the Messiah, but as someone who will provide for them the way Moses did. They don't see that the miracle Jesus has performed pointing to something far more necessary than a meal of bread and fish. In this miracle, Jesus is teaching them that he himself is the bread of life, the food that brings true life now and for eternity. Our gospel readings over the next 4 Sundays will address this, but in the end, the crowd will fail to understand and believe. This is the food that God provides to us in Eucharist, this bread of life, because he knows we need it in order to truly live. For true life is found in the Lord, in whom we are made one by means of baptism, as Paul speaks about in today's reading from his letter to the Ephesians. Jesus knows what the crowd wants to do, and so he stymies their efforts by going off on his own. It's not as a political king that he came to save them. Salvation would be possible only when Jesus would make his throne a rough wooden cross atop Golgotha. In this, his very body and blood are made into Eucharist for God's children. Indeed, we humans are needy. History shows that our efforts to save ourselves unfailingly come to naught. God alone gives us what we need, but we have to open our hearts to him. The consequence is tragedy if we do not. When we as individuals or as nations turn a deaf ear to God's guidance, the result is division. Remember, in the book of Genesis, after eating the forbidden fruit, the harmony that Adam and Eve had known dissolved. We see this as the man turns to the woman and places the blame on her. They trusted in themselves, not in God, and they lost paradise. Brothers and sisters, there is but one way to win rather than lose the way Adam and Eve did, and that's by trusting in God to provide. Just as Jesus provided more than enough food for the hungry crowd, so God does for all the world. Our job is to cooperate. As the boy in the gospel passage made the loaves and fish available to Jesus, we must make available to God what God has given to us, that all that God has bestowed on us may be used for others. Our time, talent, our material blessings. As I've said, history is very clear on what happens when we trust not in our God, but in ourselves. Do you see a surplus of peace in the world? A surplus of mercy between individuals and nations that are at odds? Do you see a surplus of food for the hungry? Do you see a surplus of unity in the world? These things are lacking because of the choices that we make, just as Adam and Eve chose poorly so long ago. Jesus Christ alone provides what we need, and it's right here at our disposal. That's why we're here, to share in the body and blood of our Savior. And then we go forth and share what he has given to us. We live the gospel. We proclaim it by our words and our deeds, recognizing we don't live for ourselves, but for God. And in this way, the unity that Paul speaks so beautifully about in Ephesians slowly comes to pass as we put ourselves at God's disposal.